The morning Ryan Callahan disappeared, his mother folded his favorite grey hoodie and placed it on his bed, still warm from the dryer. It was October 17th, 2003, and the autumn light came thin and watery through the kitchen window of their split-level home in suburban Portland. Michelle Callahan had made French toast that morning because Ryan, 17 and perpetually hungry, had mentioned craving it the night before. She remembered the sound of the spatula scraping the pan, the smell of cinnamon mixing with the sharper scent of coffee, and the way her son had shuffled into the kitchen in socks that had a hole near the left toe. Ryan ate quickly, said something about meeting friends at the library to study for his chemistry exam, and grabbed his backpack, a navy JanSport with a small tear along the bottom zipper that Michelle kept meaning to sew. He kissed her cheek, called out goodbye to his younger sister Emma, and stepped into the cool morning. Michelle watched him walk down the driveway, hands shoved in the pockets of that grey hoodie, and noticed he'd forgotten his water bottle on the counter. She thought about calling after him, but didn't. The October air carried the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace down the street. The neighborhood felt ordinary that day, unremarkable in every way that matters before everything changes. He never came home. By evening, when Ryan missed dinner and his phone went straight to voicemail, Michelle felt the first cold prickle of worry. By midnight, when his friends confirmed he'd never shown up at the library, that prickle became a scream. She called the police at 1:15 in the morning, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, and gave them a description. 17 years old, 5'10", sandy brown hair, blue eyes, wearing jeans, a white t-shirt, and that grey hoodie. She mentioned the hole in his sock, though she wasn't sure why that detail mattered. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Asking questions, Michelle answered on autopilot, while her mind raced through possibilities she couldn't yet name. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Stories like Ryan's matter, and your engagement helps us tell them. Now, let's continue. The Portland Police Department opened a missing persons case within hours. Ryan wasn't a runaway risk. He had no history of disappearing, no documented conflicts at home, decent grades, a small circle of friends who described him as quiet but reliable. His bank account showed no activity after October 16th. His social media had gone silent. The library's security footage confirmed he'd never entered the building that day. Detective Sarah Kovach, a 20-year veteran with gentle eyes and a methodical approach to cases that others wrote off too quickly, took lead on the investigation. She interviewed Ryan's friends, teachers and neighbors, searching for cracks in the routine, for signs of struggle or intention, for the invisible patterns that sometimes emerge only in hindsight. The search began at dawn on October 19th. Volunteers flooded Forest Park, the massive urban wilderness on Portland's western edge, combing through trails Ryan was known to hike. Michelle had mentioned he sometimes went there to think, to escape the noise of teenage life, to find quiet among the Douglas firs and western red cedars. Search dogs picked up his scent along the Wildwood Trail, but lost it near a fork that branched towards steeper terrain. Police helicopters swept overhead, their rotors chopping the autumn air, thermal imaging cameras scanning the canopy below. Flyers appeared on telephone poles, in coffee shops, at bus stops. Ryan's school photo staring out with an easy smile, a phone number printed below in bold letters, a plea for information. By the third day, a tip came in that briefly ignited hope. A gas station attendant in Longview, Washington, about 50 miles north, claimed she'd seen a teenager matching Ryan's description buying a Gatorade and beef jerky on October 18th, the day after he vanished. The timestamp on the receipt was 2:47 p.m. Detective Kovach drove there herself, reviewed the grainy surveillance tape, felt her pulse quicken at the figure in a grey hoodie approaching the counter. But when technicians enhanced the image and compared it frame by frame with Ryan's photos, the resemblance dissolved. Different nose, different build, different gait. Another dead end in a growing list that would eventually fill 3 binders in Kovac's office. The toll on the Callahan family was immediate and brutal. Michelle stopped sleeping through the night, kept Ryan's room exactly as he'd left it, the grey hoodie still folded on his bed like a relic from a life that had simply stopped mid-sentence. Emma, 15, withdrew into herself, stopped going to volleyball practice, started having panic attacks at school whenever she saw boys who resembled her brother from behind. Their father, David, who worked long hours as an engineer, took unpaid leave to coordinate search efforts, to drive to neighboring counties following up on sightings that always evaporated under scrutiny. The mortgage payments became difficult. Credit card debt accumulated. The holidays passed like open wounds, Thanksgiving with an empty chair, Christmas with unopened gifts beneath the tree that Michelle couldn't bring herself to remove until March. Michelle created a routine to survive the uncertainty. Every morning, she'd sit at the kitchen table with a notebook, documenting new leads, organizing volunteer schedules, updating the website she'd built at 3 a.m. one sleepless night. Find Ryan Callahan. Org. She spoke to other families of the missing, learned the language of NCMEC reports and NamUs databases, discovered the vast and terrible network of people living in this same liminal hell. She learned about the National Crime Information Center, about how dental records and DNA samples get entered into databases that might, someday, produce a match. She learned that teenagers go missing in America constantly, that the statistics are staggering, that most cases go cold within weeks as resources shift to newer emergencies. Detective Kovacs never gave up, but the active investigation gradually cooled by necessity. By 2005, Ryan's case joined the ranks of the unsolved, the file thick with dead-end leads and witness statements that contradicted each other. New missing persons cases demanded resources, demanded the same intense initial response that Ryan's had received. Michelle continued her vigil, aging in ways that weren't just physical. Her laugh became rare, her optimism calcified into grim determination, her marriage to David strained under the weight of loss they processed differently. She kept a calendar on her desk marked with anniversaries. The day he disappeared, his birthday, the day he would have graduated high school, the day he should have started college. Each date was a small death she had to survive again. The procedural machinery continued quietly in the background, running on institutional momentum even when human attention faded. Ryan's DNA profile sat in CODIAS, the combined DNA index system used by law enforcement nationwide to match biological evidence across jurisdictions. His dental records were filed with the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, cross-referenced against unidentified remains discovered anywhere in the country. Age progression photos were generated every few years by forensic artists, showing what Ryan might look like at 20, at 25, at 30. These images felt like science fiction to Michelle, her son's face aging without her, becoming a stranger in digital renderings that she both studied obsessively and couldn't bear to look at. Years passed like silt accumulating at the bottom of a river, each one adding weight but changing nothing visible on the surface. Emma graduated high school, went to college in Seattle to escape the shadow of her brother's absence, became a social worker specializing in trauma because some wounds become vocations. David's hair went gray. His relationship with Michelle became cordial but distant. Two people orbiting the same black hole without touching. Michelle became a fixture at missing persons conferences, advocating for better protocols, for faster DNA testing, for interagency communication that might prevent other families from living in her particular hell. She never moved from the house. She kept Ryan's room intact, changing the sheets regularly, dusting the desk, maintaining the shrine to a life interrupted. The grey hoodie remained on the bed, though eventually Michelle put it in a sealed plastic bag to preserve whatever traces of Ryan might still cling to the fabric. Skin cells, hair, scent molecules that might someday matter in ways she couldn't predict. Then came September 2017, 14 years and 11 months after Ryan disappeared. The call arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Michelle was in the garden, pulling weeds from around the rose bushes she'd planted the year after Ryan vanished, when her phone rang with an unfamiliar area code. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective James Chen, Sarah Kovach's successor after her retirement in 2014. He spoke carefully, each word weighted with significance, and the awareness that what he was about to say could shatter or resurrect. A young man had walked into a hospital in Boise, Idaho, claiming he didn't know his own name. He'd been living on the streets, surviving on odd jobs and shelters, when a seizure landed him in the emergency room. Standard protocols required staff to check for missing persons matches when unidentified patients arrived. When they ran his description and approximate age through databases, Ryan Callahan's name appeared as a potential match. Michelle's knees buckled. She sat hard on the grass, dirt under her fingernails, phone pressed so tight against her ear it hurt. Detective Chen explained they needed to move carefully, that physical identification was required, that DNA testing would take days, but fingerprints might be faster. Ryan had been printed as part of a school safety program in 2002, those prints still in the system. The hospital could send the prints electronically for comparison. Did she want to come to Boise, or should they arrange for the young man to be brought to Portland? Michelle heard herself say she'd be on the next flight, heard her voice sound strange and distant, heard Detective Chen promise to meet her at the airport. She was on a plane that evening, Emma beside her, both of them silent with hope too fragile to speak aloud. The hospital was a low brick building on the west side of Boise, surrounded by parking lots and the autumn yellows of cottonwood trees that reminded Michelle painfully of Portland. She walked through automatic doors with Detective Chen beside her, his presence steady and grounding, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching. A social worker named Patricia met them in a small conference room, her expression professionally compassionate in that specific way that comes from delivering life-changing news regularly. She explained that the young man, they were calling him John Doe, until identity was confirmed, was cooperative but profoundly confused. He claimed fragments of memory, living somewhere with mountains, a woman who might have been his mother, the smell of cinnamon. But he had no concrete details, no last name, no address, no social security number, no explanation for the years between then and now. They showed Michelle a photograph first, a procedural kindness to prepare her for what might not be recognition. The face staring back from the printout was older, thinner, weathered by years outdoors in ways that spoke of harsh winters and insufficient shelter, but the eyes were blue, the shape of the jaw familiar. The way his hair fell across his forehead matched the cowlick Ryan had always complained about, the one that refused to stay flat no matter how much gel he used. Michelle's hands shook so badly she couldn't hold the paper. Emma took it from her, studied it with clinical distance, then looked at her mother with tears streaming down her face. The meeting room they chose was neutral and small, with windows that looked out onto a courtyard where pigeons congregated near a fountain. Michelle sat in a plastic chair, Chen beside her, Patricia across the table, Emma standing near the window because she couldn't make herself sit still. They brought him in slowly, giving him space to consent, to back out if he felt overwhelmed, respecting his autonomy even as they upended his reality. The young man who entered was tall and lean, wearing donated clothes from the hospital's charity closet, grey sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt that hung loose on his frame. He moved cautiously, like someone still learning to trust that the ground beneath him was solid, the doors wouldn't lock behind him, that the people in this room meant what they said about safety. Michelle stood, Her breath caught in her chest, trapped between her ribs and her throat. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression searching, uncertain, processing something he couldn't name. Then he said the words that would later become the title of every news report, every true crime documentary, every think piece about memory and identity. "I belong here." It wasn't quite recognition. It was something stranger, more instinctual. A sense of rightness he couldn't explain, a pull toward this woman whose face meant nothing to his conscious mind but everything to something deeper. Michelle crossed the room and stopped 3 feet away, respecting boundaries, letting him control the distance, fighting every maternal instinct to close the gap and hold him. She noticed his hands, the way his right thumb rubbed against his fingertips, a nervous habit Ryan had developed as a child. She noticed the small scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bike at age 9, the scar she'd kissed 100 times. "Ryan?" Her voice barely functioned. He nodded, uncertain. "I think so, maybe. I don't know." The fingerprint results came back 2 days later, processed through the integrated automated fingerprint identification system with priority status that Detective Chen had personally requested. Match confirmed. 10 points of comparison, then 20, then more than enough to satisfy any court in the country. The DNA test, drawn immediately but slower to process through the lab backlog, would corroborate it a week later, but the prints were enough for now. This was Ryan Michael Callahan, missing since October 17, 2003, now 31 years old, found alive against every statistical probability. But Ryan's own words, "I belong here," were about to be tested in ways nobody anticipated. The immediate aftermath was a blur of medical evaluations and psychological assessments conducted with the careful precision of doctors who knew they were documenting something unusual. Dr. Lisa Brennan, a neuropsychologist specializing in dissociative disorders and trauma-induced amnesia, took lead on Ryan's case. She explained to Michelle that his memory loss was likely psychogenic, not caused by physical brain damage, but by trauma severe enough to fracture identity itself. The seizure that brought him to the hospital was unrelated, possibly genetic, they'd need more testing, but it had triggered the medical intervention that led to identification. Without it, Ryan might have remained John Doe indefinitely, another invisible person cycling through shelters and street corners. Ryan's amnesia was profound, but selective in ways that fascinated Dr. Brennan. He remembered how to read, how to tie his shoes, how to navigate a city bus system, how to find free meals and safe places to sleep. He'd forgotten his identity, his family, his childhood, the entire architecture of self that most people take for granted. When Dr. Brennan showed him photos from his adolescence, he studied them like historical documents about a stranger. When Michelle told him stories about his childhood, the time he'd broken his arm jumping off the garage roof, the summer they'd driven to the coast, and he'd been stung by a jellyfish, he listened politely, absorbing information without the spark of recognition. The story Ryan could piece together was fragmentary and incomplete. He remembered waking up in Seattle in late 2003 with no wallet, no ID, no memory of how he'd gotten there. The earliest clear memory was standing outside a Greyhound station in the rain, soaked through, with no idea where he'd come from or where he was going. He'd survived on the streets, learning the rhythms of shelter life, the locations of free meals, the best places to sleep unseen. He'd moved between cities, Portland to Seattle to Spokane to Boise, always feeling pulled by something he couldn't name, a restlessness that never let him settle. He'd avoided police, terrified of being arrested for something he couldn't remember doing, convinced on some level that he was running from consequences he'd forgotten. He'd worked under the table when he could find it, washing dishes in restaurants that didn't ask questions, cleaning storefronts before dawn, doing landscaping for cash. He'd learned to be invisible, to move through the world without leaving traces, to exist in the gaps between official documentation and social services. The years had blurred together, marked only by seasons and the slow accumulation of exhaustion. Michelle wanted to bring him home immediately, to install him in his preserved bedroom, to reclaim the 14 lost years through sheer force of will and maternal love. But Dr. Brennan cautioned against rushing, against the fantasy of immediate restoration. Ryan's sense of self was fragile, constructed from fragments and survival instincts rather than coherent memory. Overwhelming him with a past he couldn't access might cause him to retreat further, to reject the identity being imposed on him, to run again. They needed to move slowly, to let memory return organically if it was going to return at all, to build trust before trying to reconstruct a life. The grey hoodie became a bridge between past and present. Michelle had brought it with her to Boise, still sealed in its plastic bag, still carrying whatever traces of Ryan from 2003 might remain. When she showed it to Ryan in a controlled, therapeutic setting with Dr. Brennan present, he stared at it for a long time. His hands reached out, hesitated, then touched the fabric through the plastic with a gentleness that made Michelle's chest ache. He described a sensation, not quite memory, but recognition on a level below consciousness, like hearing a song you've forgotten, but your body still knows. He said it felt safe. He said it smelled like home, though the sealed bag shouldn't have carried any scent at all, though what he was responding to was something deeper than olfactory memory. Over the following weeks, they worked to reintegrate Ryan into his family with the careful deliberation of archaeologists reassembling pottery shards. Emma flew out to Boise, approached her brother with careful hope tempered by years of grief. She told him stories about their childhood, showed him photos on her phone, waited for sparks of recognition that came slowly and incompletely. David video-called daily, his face aged and hopeful on the small screen, talking about baseball games they'd attended together, about teaching Ryan to drive, about the graduation Ryan had missed. They didn't push. They let Ryan lead, let him set the pace, let him decide how much history he could absorb at once. But 3 weeks after the reunion, a hospital administrator named Gerald Morrison requested a meeting with Detective Chen. Morrison worked in medical records, a detail-oriented man in his 50s who'd spent 30 years in hospital bureaucracy and prided himself on catching discrepancies others missed. Something had bothered him about Ryan's case, a small irregularity in the initial emergency room paperwork that he couldn't shake. When Ryan was brought in with a seizure, standard procedure included checking for medical history through available databases, insurance records, previous hospitalizations, prescription history. Morrison had found something that didn't align with the story Ryan was telling, with the narrative of complete amnesia since 2003. The hospital files broke the lie. Buried in Ryan's medical records from the Boise hospital was a reference to previous treatment, flagged through an interstate health information exchange, not from 2003, but from 2011. A clinic in Spokane, Washington had treated someone matching Ryan's physical description and approximate age for a broken wrist, and the patient had provided a name: Kyle Matthews. The clinic had submitted insurance billing under that name through a Washington state Medicaid account. When Morrison cross-referenced it through careful database work that went beyond standard protocols, he found something impossible to ignore, something that threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew. Kyle Matthews had a social security number. He had a birth certificate filed in Tacoma. He had a documented history that stretched back years, rental agreements, utility bills, employment records. According to these documents, Kyle Matthews was born in 1985 in Tacoma, Washington, to parents who died in a car accident in 2004. He'd lived a relatively normal life until 2010, when he'd been reported missing by an ex-girlfriend named Jennifer Reeves, who'd filed a police report after he'd vanished following an argument about money. The missing persons case for Kyle Matthews remained open in Spokane County. Detective Chen brought this information to Dr. Brennan first, then to Michelle, before confronting Ryan. The implications were staggering and painful. If Ryan Callahan and Kyle Matthews were the same person, it meant one of several possibilities. Either someone was lying deliberately, constructing an elaborate deception for reasons nobody could fathom, or something far more complex was happening, something that challenged simple narratives about memory and identity. The possibility of malingering, faking amnesia, seemed unlikely given the circumstances of Ryan's discovery, but Chen couldn't dismiss it entirely. The DNA test removed all doubt about physical identity. The man in the Boise hospital was definitively, unquestionably Ryan Michael Callahan. The fingerprints matched perfectly. The dental records, when finally obtained and compared, matched. But the medical records showing Kyle Matthews receiving treatment in 2011, 8 years after Ryan's disappearance, were also real, also documented, also undeniable. Ryan had lived years under a different identity, had constructed or been given an entirely separate life, complete with social security number and verifiable history. The confrontation happened in Dr. Brennan's office, with Detective Chen present and Michelle waiting in another room at her own request, unable to bear witnessing whatever truth was about to emerge. Dr. Brennan showed Ryan the documents, explained what they'd found, asked him gently to help them understand, and slowly, over hours, the real story began to surface. Ryan had indeed disappeared from Portland in 2003, but not randomly, not as a victim of abduction or accident. Through months of careful therapy and investigative work that followed, fragments emerged. Ryan had been struggling with untreated depression and identity questions he didn't have language for at 17. He'd been experiencing what he couldn't name as gender dysphoria, feeling trapped in expectations and a body that didn't match some internal reality. He'd walked into Forest Park that October day with his backpack weighted with rocks, intending to end his life in the deep ravines where searchers might never find him. But something had stopped him. A hiker, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, had found him sitting on a cliff edge, had recognized the specific stillness of someone making final calculations. She'd sat beside him without asking questions, had talked about the weather and the trees and her grandchildren, had offered him her granola bar and bottled water. She'd walked with him back to the trailhead, had given him $40 from her wallet, had asked if he'd be okay. Ryan had lied and said yes, but instead of going home, ashamed and terrified of the worry he'd caused, convinced he'd destroyed his family with his weakness and his strangeness, Ryan had hitchhiked north. He'd intended to try again in a different forest, to disappear where nobody would search. But the days stretched on, and survival became its own purpose. He'd lived on the streets of Seattle for months, and somewhere in that time he'd met people who operated in the underground economy of forged documents and stolen identities. Kyle Matthews had been a real person, a young man who died in the car accident that killed his parents in 2004. Someone in Seattle's shadow economy had harvested his identity, had created documents that Ryan purchased for $300 he'd earned washing dishes. The person who'd done it had assured Ryan the real Kyle Matthews had no living relatives, that using the identity hurt nobody. Ryan, desperate for a fresh start and a chance to be someone else entirely, had become Kyle Matthews. He'd lived as Kyle from 2005 to 2016, 11 years of constructed identity. He'd held jobs, had relationships, had rented apartments, had built a life in Spokane that felt more authentic than being Ryan Callahan ever had. As Kyle, he'd started hormone therapy in 2009, had begun the medical transition that answered the questions he'd carried since adolescence. As Kyle, he'd been happier than Ryan had ever managed to be. But trauma has layers, and lies compound. By 2015, Kyle Matthews began experiencing severe dissociative episodes triggered by untreated PTSD and the stress of maintaining a false identity, by the guilt of family he'd abandoned and the fear of discovery. He'd stopped taking hormones, stopped going to therapy, started drifting again. The ex-girlfriend who'd reported him missing in 2010 had been real. The relationship had been real. The argument about money had been real. He'd run from that too. The seizure in 2017 was the breaking point. When Ryan woke in the Boise hospital, his mind had fractured further, had suppressed both Ryan and Kyle in a dissociative episode so profound that Dr. Brennan compared it to psychological death and resurrection. What remained was something fragmented, carrying pieces of both identities, but coherent as neither. The instinctive pull of belonging he'd felt seeing Michelle's face wasn't recovered memory. It was something deeper, the body recognizing home even when the mind couldn't. The legal implications were immediate and complicated. Ryan had committed identity fraud, had lived under false documents for years, had filed taxes under a dead man's social security number. But prosecutors in Washington and Idaho, looking at the circumstances, a traumatized teenager, years of untreated mental illness, genuine dissociative amnesia at the time of hospital identification, declined to press criminal charges. Instead, they focused on restitution for the social security fraud and ordered mandatory mental health treatment that Ryan was already receiving. The family of the real Kyle Matthews, tracked down through genealogy databases, was informed and chose not to pursue civil action after learning the full story. Michelle had to grieve twice, once for the son who'd disappeared, and again for the 14 years he'd chosen to stay gone, for the deliberate construction of a life that excluded her. Emma struggled with anger alongside relief, with the betrayal of knowing Ryan had been alive and findable and had actively hidden. David withdrew emotionally, unable to process the layers of deception and illness, unable to reconcile the son he'd lost with the person who'd been found. The family therapy sessions were brutal and necessary, excavating resentments and pain that had nowhere to go when Ryan was simply missing. Ryan himself existed in liminal space, working with Dr. Brennan to integrate fragments of both identities into something coherent. He remembered being Ryan now, remembered the childhood and the depression and the morning he'd walked into the forest. He remembered being Kyle, remembered the freedom and the fear and the slow unraveling. He worked to build something new from the pieces, someone who could acknowledge the running and the hiding and the profound wish to be anyone other than Ryan Callahan. The grey hoodie sat in evidence storage for months, needed for the administrative paperwork, closing the missing persons case, and documenting the identity fraud investigation. But when it was finally released, Michelle washed it carefully and left it folded on Ryan's bed. The bed she'd kept untouched for 14 years, the bed that now seemed like a shrine to someone who'd never existed in the uncomplicated way she'd imagined. Ryan moved home slowly, incrementally, spending weekends at first while maintaining his own apartment in Boise, where he felt safer. The reunification process stretched across months, then years. He worked with a team of therapists specializing in trauma integration and identity reconstruction, in gender dysphoria and family systems work. He restarted hormone therapy in 2018, began the medical transition that Kyle had started and Ryan had interrupted. Michelle learned new language, new ways of loving, new skills for supporting someone rebuilding themselves from fragments. She learned to call Ryan they when asked, to respect the fluidity that came from living as two people and becoming a third. Emma gradually softened, though the relationship remained complicated. She'd lost a brother and gained a sibling who was neither the person she'd grown up with nor a stranger, something in between that defied easy categories. David never fully reconciled, attended family events with polite distance, sent birthday cards, but couldn't bridge the chasm between expectation and reality. The foundation that emerged from their story, the Callahan Project, focused on LGBTQ youth mental health, runaway prevention, and support for families navigating identity-related disappearances. Michelle became a spokesperson for the invisible runaways, the ones who weren't kidnapped but who fled internal wars too painful to name. She spoke at conferences about the complexity of disappearance, about how finding someone alive doesn't always mean getting them back, about loving people through transformations you never imagined you'd witness. Emma used her social work training to develop protocols for family reunification when identity trauma was involved, when the person who returns isn't the person who left, when DNA matches but nothing else does. She wrote academic papers about ambiguous loss, about the grief that comes when someone is physically present but psychologically absent, about the peculiar limbo of having a sibling who's both alive and gone. Ryan gradually began speaking publicly about the experience, not as Ryan Callahan or Kyle Matthews, but as someone learning to integrate both, to acknowledge the running and the return, to name the pain that had sent a 17-year-old into the woods with pockets full of rocks and no intention of coming back. The story became teaching material for first responders, for mental health professionals who encounter young people teetering on edges visible and invisible, for families trying to navigate the wreckage of untreated illness and unspoken pain. The speaking engagements were difficult, required Ryan to stand before audiences and dissect the worst moments of two lives, to explain the fractured logic of suicide attempts and identity theft and dissociative amnesia. But they mattered. After one talk at a high school in Portland, a 17-year-old student approached Ryan, said they'd been planning something similar, said hearing Ryan's story had changed their mind. It wasn't dramatic, no tears, no declarations, just a quiet conversation in a school hallway, but it was enough. The final piece of resolution came 18 months after the hospital identification. Ryan, sitting in the kitchen where Michelle had made French toast that last morning in 2003, told her about the hiker who'd talked them down from the cliff. They'd never filed a report, never contacted police, had simply given Ryan their granola bar and walked with them back to the trailhead before going their separate ways. Ryan wanted to find them, to say thank you, to close a circle that had remained open for 15 years. Through patient detective work and social media outreach, posting in hiking groups and Portland area forums, they located the hiker, a retired teacher named Carol Nguyen, who'd been visiting Portland the week Ryan disappeared, who remembered that October afternoon with painful clarity. When they met at a coffee shop in downtown Portland in 2019, Carol remembered the frightened teenager on the cliff, remembered thinking she'd done something small and hoping it was enough but never knowing, never following up for fear of intruding or making things worse. It had been enough, barely, by the thinnest margin, but enough to buy Ryan the days they needed to choose survival over the alternative, to stumble into an identity theft that became an accidental lifeline, to eventually, through seizure and chance and database cross-referencing, find a way back to people who'd never stopped searching. The conversation at the coffee shop lasted 3 hours. Carol cried. Ryan cried. Michelle, who'd insisted on coming, cried. They talked about intervention and intention, about the small acts that ripple outward in ways we never see, about the responsibility of witnessing someone else's pain. Carol had spent 15 years wondering if she'd done the right thing, if she should have called police, if her hands-off approach had been help or harm. Ryan told her it was help, that police would have returned them to a life they couldn't survive, that the space she'd given them to choose their own next step, even if that step was running, had mattered more than any forced intervention. They stayed in contact after that. Carol attended Ryan's college graduation in 2022, When Ryan finally completed the education Kyle had started, and Ryan had interrupted, she came to the first annual Callahan Project fundraiser, donated generously, told her story as part of the panel on bystander intervention and crisis response. The Callahan house doesn't preserve Ryan's room like a shrine anymore. It's a guest room now, painted soft blue, with a desk and a bookshelf, and normal markers of life continuing forward. The grey hoodie, the original returned from evidence, hangs framed in Michelle's office at the Callahan Project headquarters, a reminder of absence and return, of the objects that outlast the people who wear them. Ryan has their own apartment downtown now, lives independently, works as a peer counselor for runaway youth, and maintains a quiet life that includes therapy twice a week and medication that keeps the dissociative episodes manageable. Michelle's garden has expanded, filled with native plants that bloom at different seasons, marking time in beauty instead of absence. She still tracks missing persons cases, still advocates for policy changes and better resources, but she's learned to live with ambiguity, with the knowledge that resolution doesn't always mean restoration. Her marriage to David ended in 2020, not dramatically but quietly. Two people who'd survived different versions of the same loss and couldn't find their way back to each other. Emma works at a clinic in Seattle, specializes in family therapy for complex trauma, writes Ryan long emails about her cases without breaking confidentiality, seeks their perspective on the peculiar grief of loving someone who returns as someone else. The sibling relationship they've built isn't the one they lost, but it's real and chosen and honest, in ways the childhood version never could have been. Ryan's work with runaway youth focuses on the ones who disappeared deliberately, who need safe places to land that aren't the homes they fled. They help connect kids with resources, with housing that doesn't require family reconciliation, with medical care that respects their autonomy. They teach workshops on identity document navigation for kids who need to be someone other than their birth certificates say they are. It's work born from direct experience, from understanding what it means to run and what it costs to return. The grey hoodie in Michelle's office gets photographed by journalists sometimes, included in human interest pieces about the Callahan Project. Michelle always tells them it's not a symbol of recovery or reunion. It's evidence that objects persist while people transform, that the artifacts of who we were don't determine who we become. Ryan left wearing it and returned having been someone else entirely. The hoodie stayed the same. That paradox contains the whole story. If you're struggling with thoughts of self-harm, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline offers 24/7 support at 988. The Trevor Project provides crisis intervention for LGBTQ youth at 1-866-488-7386. The Trans Lifeline offers peer support at 1-877-565-8860. Running away doesn't end pain. It only relocates it, compounds it, transforms it into something harder to name. But returning, even after years, even after becoming someone else, even after the profound fracture of self, returning is possible. The belonging Ryan spoke of in that hospital room wasn't about geography or DNA or family in the conventional sense. It was about the slow, painful, necessary work of coming home to yourself, whoever that self turns out to be. Sometimes that means going back to where you started. Sometimes it means integrating pieces of everyone you've been into someone new. Sometimes it means accepting that the person who left and the person who returned are both real and both gone, replaced by someone still learning to exist in the aftermath of their own disappearance. Michelle keeps a photo on her desk now, taken at the 2023 Callahan Project fundraiser. Ryan stands between her and Carol Nguyen, all three of them smiling, all three of them alive against odds that seemed insurmountable in October 2003. The photo isn't about healing, because some wounds don't heal in the sense of disappearing. It's about living anyway, about building something meaningful from the wreckage, about the stubborn persistence of love through transformations that should have destroyed it. The hospital files that broke the lie also, eventually, revealed the truth. That identity is more fluid and fragile than we pretend. That disappearance isn't always what it seems. That sometimes people need to become someone else to survive becoming themselves. Ryan's story doesn't fit neatly into categories of victim or perpetrator, of tragedy or triumph. It exists in the complicated middle space where most actual lives unfold. And that middle space, messy and unresolved and real, is where the work happens, where families learn to love people they don't fully understand, where the missing become found without becoming who they were before, where hoodies fold themselves into evidence and memories fracture into pieces that never quite reassemble, but somehow, improbably, manage to hold together anyway.